July 26th, 2026, and something just shifted in NATO that a lot of people are going to regret sleeping on. Turkey is getting the F-35. Not maybe, not someday, not in some distant hypothetical column of a defense magazine. 6 jets, an initial transaction, already reportedly built, sitting in the United States, waiting on paperwork and a presidential signature to become the most dangerous variable introduced into the Eastern Mediterranean in over a decade. And when I say dangerous, I don't mean dangerous to Iran, I don't mean dangerous to Russia, I mean dangerous to 2 of America's own allies sitting right next door, watching this unfold in real time with their jaws on the floor. Greece and Israel. 2 countries that fly the same jet, that trust the same jet with their national survival, now watching Washington hand the crown jewel of Western air power to a government that spent the last several years cozying up to Moscow, buying a Russian air defense system specifically designed to shoot this exact aircraft out of the sky, and never fully walking that decision back. So let's get into what actually happened, because the sequencing here matters. On July 7th and 8th, NATO leaders gathered in Ankara for a summit hosted by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan himself. And sitting right there next to him was President Trump. During that meeting, Trump announced that Washington would lift the sanctions that had been sitting on Turkey since 2020. Sanctions triggered under CAATSA, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, the exact same legal mechanism used to punish countries that do business with Russian, Iranian, or North Korean military hardware. Turkey got hit with CAATSA because back in 2019 they went out and bought the S-400. That's a Russian-made long-range surface-to-air missile system built by the same defense industry that also builds the interceptors, meant to shoot down the very aircraft Turkey was simultaneously trying to buy from the United States. Think about how insane that actually is for a second. You're a NATO member. You're supposed to be inside the alliance's collective defense umbrella, and you go out and purchase the signature air defense weapon of the alliance's primary adversary, then turn around and ask to also fly the alliance's most advanced stealth fighter. That's not diplomacy, that's having your cake, eating it, and then asking for a second slice while everyone else at the table watches you do it. Back when that S-400 purchase actually happened, the United States didn't just get annoyed, they acted. Turkey was formally removed from the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program in 2019. And here's the part people forget. Turkey wasn't some random customer buying jets off a shelf. Turkey was one of the 9 founding international partners of the entire F-35 program, going all the way back to 2002, and they poured close to $1.4 billion into the development of this aircraft. Turkish aerospace industries, KAAN Aerospace, Alp Aviation, AESA's, Roketsan. These companies were manufacturing structural components, landing gear assemblies, wiring harnesses, engine parts, cockpit displays for years. Turkey's labor costs were lower than most other NATO partners, which made them a genuinely useful industrial node inside the F-35 supply chain. The first Turkish F-35A was actually rolled out in a ceremony in Texas back in June of 2018. It never made it to Turkish soil. It sat in the United States for training instead, and then the whole relationship collapsed months later once that S-400 deal went through. Turkey originally wanted around 130 F-35As. That number eventually got trimmed down in planning to somewhere around 40, and now, in this new deal being floated, we're talking about an initial batch of just 6 jets. 6. From a program they helped build with over $1 billion of their own money and decades of industrial partnership. So why now? Why is this suddenly moving after years of complete deadlock? Because the relationship between Trump and Erdogan has clearly warmed in a way that's making a lot of people nervous. At that NATO summit, Trump told reporters he was going to do something that would make Turkey very happy. And then he delivered on it days later by publicly floating the sanctions relief and openly discussing the F-35 sale. Erdogan, for his part, has been telling reporters that the United States has largely lifted defense sanctions on Turkey already, and that Trump has what he called a positive approach toward moving forward with the jets. There's also been movement on a separate but connected track, the sale of F-110 engines worth roughly $700 million, engines that Turkey desperately wants for its homegrown fifth-generation fighter program called KAAN. That's Turkey's attempt to build its own stealth jet from the ground up, joining an incredibly exclusive club of nations that can even attempt fifth-generation fighter production, a club that currently includes the United States, China, and Russia. If Turkey gets those engines and gets back into the F-35 pipeline at the same time, they're not just buying an aircraft, they're accelerating their entire domestic defense industrial base using American technology as the springboard. Now here's where the actual obstacle still sits, and it's a big one. Turkey never actually got rid of the S-400. They still have it, sitting on Turkish soil, fully operational, fully capable of doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is detect, track, and engage the very same F-35s Turkey is now trying to acquire. You cannot operate a Russian radar and missile system built to specifically hunt fifth-generation stealth aircraft in the same airspace where you're also flying that stealth aircraft, because the S-400's radar would be sitting there, essentially building a live signature profile of the F-35, learning exactly how it looks, how it moves, how it can be tracked and targeted. That intelligence doesn't just stay in Turkey. Given Turkey's relationship with Moscow, given that Russian engineers built and maintain elements of that system, there's a very real fear that operational data gathered from watching an actual F-35 up close could make its way back to Russia, and from there potentially to China as well. Two of the exact countries the F-35 was designed to outmatch in the first place. So Ankara has been scrambling to find a workaround, and what they landed on is trying to offload the S-400 to a third country entirely, rather than sending it back to Russia. Reports indicate Turkey has actually been in discussions to potentially transfer the system to the United Arab Emirates. But here's the catch that a lot of the breathless headlines are skipping over. Turkey doesn't get to just resell a Russian weapon system to whoever they want. Under the terms these systems are typically sold under, Russia has to actually approve any transfer to a third party. So Turkey is in this bizarre position where the path to getting back into America's most advanced fighter jet program runs directly through Moscow's permission slip. Erdogan floated the idea of simply giving the S-400 back to Russia outright months ago, and by all accounts, that idea went basically nowhere. So now they're trying the third country transfer route instead, hoping the Kremlin signs off on losing a customer relationship it clearly values as leverage over Turkey, and, by extension, over NATO cohesion. Let's pause on that for a second, because that's honestly the funniest part of this entire situation if it weren't so serious. Turkey spent years telling the world the S-400 purchase was about sovereignty, about not being told what to do by Washington, about strategic independence. And now here they are, needing Vladimir Putin's blessing to hand that same system off to a third party, just so they can go crawling back into the good graces of the same American defense establishment they supposedly didn't need. That's not strategic independence, that's strategic dependency wearing a different costume. And Moscow knows it. Every single day this transfer sits unresolved is another day Russia gets to hold a quiet veto over whether one of NATO's largest militaries gets access to fifth-generation air power. If you wanted to design a scenario that keeps Turkey tethered to Russian goodwill indefinitely, this is basically it. Now let's talk about the reaction from the two countries that actually have the most to lose here, because their responses tell you everything about how seriously this should be taken. Israel came out hard and fast. Prime Minister Netanyahu personally warned against giving the F-35 to Turkey, saying it would upset the regional balance of power. Israel's ambassador in the region called Turkey's conduct hostile and said supplying the aircraft was, in his words, undesirable at this stage. And there's a very specific technical fear underneath all of that political language. Israel operates its own unique variant of the F-35, a version modified with Israeli-made electronic warfare systems and mission software that Israel has never wanted shared with anyone, not even close allies. If Turkey ends up flying F-35s in the same theater, in the same alliance structure, there's a real concern in Jerusalem that some of that Israeli-developed technology, or at minimum the operational patterns and capabilities Israel relies on, could end up compromised or exposed to a government Israel now considers openly hostile, especially after Erdogan severed diplomatic and trade relations with Israel back in 2024 and has remained one of the most vocal international critics of Israel's operations in Gaza. So Israeli intelligence has apparently shifted strategy. If they can't stop the sale outright, they're now reportedly pushing for Turkey to receive a downgraded version of the aircraft, stripped of some of the more sensitive capabilities, essentially an F-35 with training wheels bolted on. Whether Washington actually agrees to sell a watered-down variant to a founding program partner who helped build the thing is a completely different question, and one that hasn't been answered yet. Greece is arguably even more exposed than Israel here, simply because of geography. Greece and Turkey have a decades-long rivalry over the Aegean Sea, over airspace violations, over territorial water disputes that have nearly boiled over into open conflict multiple times in recent history. Greece has already ordered its own F-35s, expecting that advanced fighter to be the thing that finally tips the qualitative balance in their favor after years of expensive competition with Turkey's larger air force. Now imagine spending billions on that jet specifically to leapfrog your rival, only to watch that same rival get access to the identical airframe. Greek Foreign Minister Nikos Dendias put it about as bluntly as a diplomat is allowed to. He said Greece would not be happy if Turkey received the F-35, and would not be happy if Turkey received the engines for the KAAN program either. Greek officials have been raising this through every diplomatic channel they have access to in Washington, reminding anyone who will listen that Turkey has repeatedly stated any unilateral extension of Greek territorial waters in the Aegean would be treated as a literal act of war, what they call a casus belli. That's not posturing from decades ago, that's an active, standing declaration from Ankara. And Greece also lobbied hard last year to block France from selling Turkey advanced Meteor air-to-air missiles, showing this fear of a shifting balance isn't new. It's been building for a long time, and the F-35 sale is just the biggest domino yet. And how did Erdogan respond to all of this pushback from two fellow regional players? Not with reassurance, not with diplomacy. He stood up at the closing press conference of that same NATO summit and said the objections from Netanyahu and Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis have, quote, no place in my world. Turkey's foreign ministry went even further, accusing Israel of running a coordinated disinformation campaign and firing back that Israel's own conduct in Gaza should disqualify it from lecturing anyone about regional stability. So think about the diplomatic temperature we're actually operating at here. This isn't two allies quietly working through a disagreement behind closed doors. This is Turkey publicly telling Israel and Greece on the record in front of the entire NATO alliance that their security concerns simply don't matter. And Washington, at least under the current posture, appears willing to move forward anyway. Congress isn't exactly rolling over on this either, for what it's worth. Democratic Congresswoman Dina Titus has been actively working to build support for a formal letter urging Congress to block any F-35 sale to Turkey outright. The Armenian National Committee of America has been mobilizing alongside Hellenic American advocacy groups, and reports indicate this opposition is genuinely bipartisan, pulling in both Republicans and Democrats who are uneasy about handing this technology to a government with Turkey's recent track record. Whether that opposition actually has the votes or the procedural tools to stop a determined White House from pushing this through is a separate question. And historically, arms sales driven by presidential will tend to find a way through eventually, especially when there's a NATO summit photo op and a personal relationship between two leaders greasing the wheels. Well, let's rewind a bit further back and put this whole saga in proper context, because the S-400 mess wasn't some isolated incident. It's part of a much longer pattern of Turkey playing both sides of the fence for years. Turkey has spent this entire decade trying to have simultaneous relationships with Washington and Moscow that would be completely contradictory for almost any other NATO member. They've bought Russian weapons while still sitting inside NATO's collective defense structure. They've hosted Russian energy projects and deepened trade ties with Moscow, even while other NATO members were tightening sanctions after the invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, Turkey has run its own military operations against Kurdish forces in northern Syria, forces that in some cases were directly backed and armed by the United States in the fight against ISIS, creating this bizarre situation where American weapons on one side of a border were effectively facing off against American weapons on the other. That's the kind of behavior that makes defense planners in Washington nervous about handing over something as sensitive as F-35 technology. Technology that, once it's out, cannot be put back in the box. Let's actually talk about why the F-35 specifically is such a massive deal to hand over, because not every fighter jet sale carries this level of weight. The F-35 isn't just an aircraft. It's a flying sensor and data fusion node. It's built around stealth characteristics that took decades and billions of dollars to perfect low observable coatings, internal weapons bays that eliminate the radar signature spikes external munitions would create, an airframe shape engineered from the ground up to be nearly invisible to conventional and even some advanced radar systems. On top of the physical airframe, the F-35 carries an avionics suite that lets the pilot see through the literal skin of the aircraft using a helmet-mounted display fed by cameras positioned around the fuselage, giving 360-degree situational awareness that older fourth-generation jets simply cannot match. It shares targeting data across a network in real time with other F-35s, with ships, with ground controllers, turning every single aircraft into a node inside a much larger web of combat awareness. That's the entire value proposition of the jet. It's not just about one plane winning one dogfight. It's about an entire connected system seeing the battlefield before anyone else does and striking before the enemy even knows they've been found. Now imagine a version of that jet, or even just knowledge of how that jet performs against a Russian-made radar system, ending up in the hands of a government that maintains open lines to Moscow and, at various points, to Beijing as well. That's the nightmare scenario defense analysts have been warning about since 2019. And it hasn't actually gone away just because a new administration decided the political relationship was worth more than the technical risk. There's also a domestic angle inside Turkey itself that's worth understanding. Because Erdogan isn't chasing this deal purely for prestige. Turkey's economy has been under real strain. Inflation has hammered ordinary Turkish citizens for years, and Erdogan has increasingly leaned on nationalist muscular foreign policy wins to shore up support at home when the economic picture looks shaky. Getting readmitted to the F-35 program, especially after years of very public rejection from Washington, would be presented domestically as a major diplomatic victory, proof that Turkey forced its way back to the table on its own terms. Combine that with the momentum building around the KAAN fighter jet program, and you can see the bigger strategic play here. Turkey isn't just trying to buy 6 jets. They're trying to position themselves as a legitimate 5th-generation air power in their own right, using American engines, American program experience, and now potentially American F-35 operational knowledge as the scaffolding to build something that, longer term, makes them far less dependent on any single outside supplier, American or Russian. That's the part that should actually worry people more than the 6 jets themselves. This isn't about the immediate delivery. It's about what doors this opens for Turkey's own defense industrial ambitions over the next decade. And here's an analogy that actually explains what's happening pretty well. Picture a neighborhood where 2 houses have been feuding for years over a property line, constantly threatening each other, occasionally getting into shouting matches that spill into the street. Then imagine a 3rd neighbor, someone who used to be friendly with both sides, but recently started borrowing tools from the sketchy guy 2 streets over, someone with a track record of showing up armed at community meetings, suddenly gets handed the exact same top-of-the-line security system that one of the feuding houses just installed to protect themselves from that very neighbor. That's basically what's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean right now. Greece bought the F-35 specifically to create separation from Turkey's air force. Israel operates a specialized F-35 variant specifically to maintain a technological edge in a region full of adversaries. And now the neighbor both of them have real documented ongoing tension with is being handed a key to the exact same system. Let's talk tactically for a moment about what this actually changes on the ground, because the F-35 isn't just a symbolic prestige item, it changes real operational calculus. Turkey already runs one of the largest air forces in NATO by aircraft count, heavily built around F-16s, many of which have been upgraded under various modernization programs over the years. Adding F-35s into that mix, even a small initial batch of 6, gives Turkey a stealth penetration capability it simply does not currently have. That means the ability to fly into contested airspace, gather intelligence, and potentially strike targets while remaining largely undetected by conventional radar systems, something none of Turkey's regional rivals besides Israel and Greece currently possess in the same class. Over the Aegean, that shifts the deterrence math in a way Greek planners have to now account for in every future defense budget and doctrine review. In Syria, where Turkish forces have repeatedly clashed with Kurdish groups and occasionally found themselves in tense proximity to Russian and even American assets, a stealth capability changes the risk calculus for everyone operating in that increasingly crowded airspace. And in the broader Eastern Mediterranean, where Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, Israel, and Egypt have all been jockeying over offshore energy, exploration rights for years, sometimes escalating to naval standoffs. Having a stealth fighter in Turkey's inventory adds a new layer of leverage Ankara didn't have before. One more layer worth digging into here, and it's honestly one of the more underappreciated angles, is what this does to the credibility of CAATSA sanctions as a deterrent tool going forward. The entire point of CAATSA is to make countries think twice before buying major Russian military hardware by threatening real painful consequences if they do. Turkey bought the S-400 anyway back in 2019, got sanctioned, got kicked out of the F-35 program, and has now spent years watching that punishment slowly get walked back through personal diplomacy and a warming relationship at the top. If Turkey ultimately gets its F-35s back, while still technically possessing the S-400, even if it's sitting in storage rather than active use, that sends an extremely clear signal to every other country watching from the sidelines. The message becomes, you can defy American sanctions policy, buy the exact weapon system designed to counter America's premier fighter jet, wait out a few years of political friction, and eventually get let back into the club anyway as long as the relationship with whoever's sitting in the White House is warm enough. That's not a hypothetical concern. That's the kind of precedent other nations with complicated relationships toward both Washington and Moscow are absolutely going to study and factor into their own procurement decisions moving forward. Now, let's give an honesty check here, because it's important not to overstate where things actually stand today. As of right now, nothing has been finalized. No jets have physically been delivered to Turkish soil. The sanctions relief that Trump announced at the NATO summit still requires the S-400 situation to be resolved in some legally coherent way. And that resolution is still tangled up in negotiations with Russia that have, by Turkey's own admission, made progress, but remain unfinished. The reported 6-jet initial transaction is still contingent on formal action from the White House, and Congress still has tools, even if imperfect ones, to slow or complicate the process if opposition continues to build. So this is very much a story still being written in real time, not a done deal sitting in a hangar in Ankara. But the direction of travel matters just as much as the final destination, and right now every single signal, from Trump's public comments to Erdogan's confident public statements about a positive approach to the reported early construction of the first 6 jets, points toward this moving forward rather than collapsing. Let's zoom out to the 40,000-foot view here, because that's really where the actual stakes live. This isn't just a story about 6 fighter jets changing hands. This is a story about whether the F-35 program, originally built as a tool to strengthen collective Western air power and technological superiority, is now becoming a bargaining chip in bilateral relationship management between individual leaders. It's a story about whether alliance cohesion inside NATO can survive one member state repeatedly hedging toward Russia while still expecting full access to the alliance's most sensitive technology. It's a story about whether Israel's qualitative military edge in the region, something Washington has explicitly guaranteed by law for decades, gets quietly eroded because a different bilateral relationship happened to be more politically convenient at a given moment. And it's a story about whether Greece, a founding NATO member that has stayed remarkably consistent in its alliance commitments for over 70 years, ends up watching a rival with a much rockier recent track record get access to the exact same premier technology Greece specifically invested in to maintain an edge. The uncomfortable truth is that this decision was never really about the merits of Turkey's behavior since 2019. If it were, this deal probably wouldn't be moving at all, because Turkey still has the S-400, still hasn't fully resolved the technology compromise concerns that got them kicked out in the first place, and still maintains a foreign policy posture that regularly puts it at odds with 2 other close American partners in the same region. This is about personal diplomatic chemistry between 2 leaders, about Turkey's growing strategic importance as a NATO member sitting on some of the most critical geography in the world, controlling access between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, hosting critical American air bases, and playing an outsized role in everything from Syria to Ukraine-adjacent diplomacy. Washington clearly believes the strategic value of keeping Turkey close outweighs the risk of upsetting Greece and Israel, and that calculation might genuinely be correct from a purely geopolitical chessboard perspective. But it comes with real costs. And those costs are going to land on 2 allies who did everything right, who never bought Russian air defense systems, who never hedged toward Moscow, and who are now being asked to simply accept a shrinking technological advantage because the math worked out that way in someone else's spreadsheet. So where does this actually go from here? The realistic path forward likely involves months more of quiet negotiation over the S-400's ultimate fate. Continued lobbying pressure from Greek and Israeli diplomats in Washington, trying to either kill the deal outright, or at minimum secure that downgraded aircraft variant Israeli officials have reportedly been pushing for. Congress will keep making noise, and depending on how loud that noise gets, it could genuinely slow the timeline even if it doesn't stop the outcome entirely. And Turkey will keep pushing forward, on parallel tracks, regardless, continuing to build out the KAAN program with or without American engines, continuing to position itself as an independent defense industrial power that isn't fully dependent on any single supplier, no matter how this F-35 situation resolves. That last part might honestly be the most important takeaway of all. Even if the F-35 deal somehow collapses tomorrow, Turkey has made it abundantly clear over the past several years that it intends to build its own path to 5th-generation air power one way or another, and every bit of American technology, expertise, or program access it can extract along the way just accelerates that timeline. What do you think about all of this? Does handing Turkey the F-35 make sense as a strategic move to keep a critical NATO member close? Or does it set a dangerous precedent that undermines the entire point of CAATSA sanctions while eroding trust with 2 allies who never wavered? Do you think Greece and Israel's concerns are being taken seriously enough? Or is this really just a done deal dressed up in diplomatic language while everyone waits for the paperwork to catch up? Drop your take in the comments. Genuinely curious to see where people land on this one, because it's rare to see an alliance decision this consequential get this little public scrutiny before it starts moving. If this kind of deep dive into what's actually happening behind the headlines is useful to you, hit like on this one and subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown, because this story is far from finished, and there's a real chance we're back here in a matter of weeks talking about the next stage of this deal, whether that's the actual delivery of those 6 jets, a Russian veto on the S-400 transfer that blows the whole thing up, or Congress finding a way to slow this down before it goes any further. Share this with anyone who's been following the Turkey situation, because most of the coverage out there is either too shallow or too one-sided to actually explain why this matters as much as it does. This is one of those stories where the details genuinely change the picture, and the picture right now is a lot more complicated and a lot more consequential than a simple headline about 6 fighter jets ever lets on.